Well, welcome. I'm excited about today's program. It is about the milling industry in Madison County. It is our oldest and first industry in Madison County. We had mills before we had any kind of industry, because mills supplied the essentials for people to live. They supplied food, they supplied shelter, and they supplied clothing. 3 essentials to be able to survive in the wilderness. And so all throughout Indiana, Madison County included, whenever a population began to grow, mills began to pop up because people had those essentials that they needed. And so I'm going to go over today some of those things here in Madison County. And I'm going to talk then at the end about our 2 principal mills, hence the title that I borrowed from Charles Dickens, Tale of 2 Mills. But at the very end, I'm going to show you a mill that is a mystery mill. Mystery to me. I don't know where it is, but it says it's here, but I've never heard of it. So that'll be your homework to bring that answer back to me. But here we go. Mill operation types in our county. There were carding mills that were spun wool or made wool for spinning. You had sawmills for timber, grist mills for grains of corn, planing mills for finished wood, and flax that ground fiber, that would be straws and seeds, into flax for linen yard or woven fabrics. All of those were essential to our pioneers. The carding mills in Madison County were the Broadbent Woolen Factory in Richland Township on Killbuck Creek, built in 1846. It was 3 stories tall. That's a big building in 1846. 150 spindles and 1 loom, 75 pounds of wool per day. What you're going to find is that the initial mills in Madison County were built on our streams, our principal streams: White River, Fall Creek, Killbuck, and Pipe Creek. Those are the 4 principal waterways in Madison County that provide enough power to power a mill. With man's ingenuity, they found out that they could move away from the water sources as long as they had a source of water, and later on they could do what were called steam-powered mills, where you would boil the water and operate the mills with steam, much like a steam engine does today or did years ago on a train. So you could develop power from steam that was heated, boiled, but initially the water was all sourced from those principal waterways in Madison County. The Robert Adams Woolen Mill in Richland Township was on Killbuck and a little bit below where Little and Big Killbuck unite on Alexandria Pike, 2.5 miles from Anderson. It was built in 1835 and enlarged in 1848. It processed 120 pounds of wool per day on 240 spindles and 1 loom. That's a lot of wool, 240 pounds of wool. Wool, when you pick it up, it weighs nothing. So that's a lot of wool. Now here's how a carding mill worked. This is not my illustration. The wool was fed into the apparatus here on a belt, and then it went through a series of cleaners that did different things to process it, and dropped out a round piece of wool that then our ancestors could take and put on a spinning wheel and spin and make fabric out of. It was operated by a water that came in, turned a tub wheel that was here, which turned a shaft, which turned these gears, and that operated. So again, they were using the flowing water as a process. Sawmills. The Lucan Steam Sawmill was on Found Creek Township on Lick Creek, built in 1852, and it was a sash mill. I'll show that to you in a minute, explain that. Florida Station, just north of here in 1867, had a sawmill that could saw 4,000 feet of lumber per day. Now that would have been a steam mill because there's no source of water at Florida Station. New Columbus, or you may know it as Ovid. We can get into that argument another day. Built in 1835 on Fall Creek. Markleville, built in 1870, could process 3,000 feet of lumber per day. Summitville, 1871, 4,000 feet of lumber per day. Another one in Summitville in 1873, built 1 mile northeast of Summitville. Frankton had a sawmill built in 1871, a short distance northeast of town. It was capable of sawing 5,000 feet of lumber per day. Perkinsville in 1871, on the northwest part of town, it could saw up 5,000 feet of lumber per day, and it shipped its product to Boston and San Francisco. Planing mills in Alexandria, built in 1872, was 2 stories high. South of the railroad on State Road 9, it was the only one of its kind in the northern part of the county. It would be for finished lumber. Sawmill cut it up rough timber. A planing mill then refined it down to where you could use it for seating, for flooring, and so forth. Pendleton had one built in 1872, a short distance below the falls on the south bank of the creek, and it was its only kind of mill in the southern part of the county. So you had 2, one at Alexandria and one at Pendleton. Anderson in 1868, 2 stories, southeast corner of 6th and Meridian. 1874, it was purchased by Nathan and Nelson Armstrong. If you go down Meridian Street today to 6th Street, across the street from the Christian Center, you see some apartments. If you look at the sign, it says Armstrong Apartments, same family. The Hoosier Mill in Anderson, built in 1867, a 2-story mill on the east side of Main, north of 6th Street. The sawmill. The log was on a carriage which was fed in. The old-fashioned way was 2 guys on the saw. But then they got smart and said, now wait a minute, if we utilize the incoming water flow, we can hook our saw up to that, and this would be the sash of the mill. When I said it was a sash mill, and it was a permanent fixture, and you just slide the wood through. That's how they could do 4,000, 5,000 feet of lumber per day, Judy. They could utilize the power that the water flow gave them. The New Columbus sawmill in 1835, a man by the name of Bailey Jackson, no relation, began the erection of a sawmill on the bank of Fall Creek at New Columbus, but abandoned it before completion. The site was subsequently purchased by James Pedden, and the mill was completed by him in 1843. Here's New Columbus, or Ovid. If you come out the Gilmore Road, you go past the Gilmore House. In the hollow behind the Gilmore House, there is a mill race, and it looks like this. What they did was they dug a mill race off of Fall Creek to bring the water supply over to the mill, and then they channeled it back into Fall Creek again. Grist mills, the most common find. Andrew Jackson, again, no relation. He had a mill at the Myers Ford on White River in 1832. Frederick Brandenburg, northwest of Chesterfield on White River in 1838. The first national mill at Pendleton on Fall Creek, built in 1848. It was 3 stories, a half mile southwest of Pendleton, south of State Road 38. Perkinsville, 1859. It was a 4-story mill. The more stories you have, the more work you can do. But you also have to have the gears and pulleys to be able to operate machinery on the 4th floor. In 1835, it shipped flour to Philadelphia and Baltimore. It ran year-round, and it was powered by the White River with a dam on White River. That dam was built in 1835 and is still there. I'll show it to you. Summitville in 1870, 2 stories. It was a steam mill. Frankton, 1859, 3 stories, south part of town near the railroad, capable of milling 40 barrels of flour per day. In Chesterfield, a grist and sawmill short distance northeast of town on Mill Creek. A grist mill built in 1824 by a massive makepiece, enlarged to 3 stories. Power supplied by Mill Creek, which turns a 20-foot overshot wheel. Sawmill adjoins, built in 1870, capable of doing 3,000 feet of lumber per day. In Anderson, the Dixon Mill, built in 1874, 3 stories, could do 75 barrels of wheat per day, located on the west side of Meridian, north of the Bell Fountain Railroad. Later, it was called, in 1878, the Henderson Mill. I've got a drawing of that. I'll show it to you. And then probably Anderson's most famous mill was the Germanna Mill. Converted from a warehouse to a mill in 1868, capable of doing 50 barrels of flour per day. It was 2 stories, located on the Cincinnati and Chicago, near the Cincinnati and Chicago Railroad Depot. Cincinnati and Chicago Railroad was the Pennsylvania Railroad. For those of you who grew up here, if you remember the Pennsylvania Depot when it was at 5th and Main, that's what they're talking about. 1878 were the Wellington Mills, and in 1900 were the Shaw Brothers Flouring Mill. I'll show you all of those. Chesterfield in 1850, 3 stories, 75 barrels of flour per day, located south of Chesterfield near the Bell Fountain Railroad. Alexandria, 1862 to 63. They proclaimed they were the second best mill in the county. It was 4 stories in height, could produce 120 barrels of flour per day, located on the south part of Alexandria near the present-day Norfolk and Southern Railroad. This is the Myers Ford, where Andrew Jackson built his mill in 1832. This is the ford. A ford is a shallow place in the river, and it was safe for people to cross, not only to walk across, but to take a wagon or a horse and buggy across. Usually there was a firm bottom to it. The firm bottom here was supplied by this bedrock that you can see here, and some of it's piled up here. Reason why you see that is that ford used to extend all the way across the river. Well, in the 1940s, the Army Corps of Engineers, in order to improve the flood conditions in Anderson, came through and removed obstructions in the river so that the water would flow quicker and easier. So what they did is they came through and tore all this out to let that water flow through, and you see the remnants of it there. The Perkinsville Mill operated as such. There was a White River. I'll use this as, it says stream, but this is an illustration. White River came in that was dammed up. Mr. Parkins, who was the Perkinsville miller, created a sluice that came off of the sluiceway here, spillway, and operated his mill and then dumped it back into the river. So today, or that became like an island in the river. Today, if you go to Perkinsville, that's a pretty sizable island in the river. If you go across State Road 13 and you look east towards Perkinsville, you'll notice 2 channels of White River there, okay? The channels are there because the channel closest to the north bank of the river was the mill race. And that's the dam that I told you about at Perkinsville. It was a crib dam mill, popular in New England for damming up water. Very simple. You took tree limbs and you fashioned them down to a certain length. You pointed both ends of them with a sharp tool, and then you drove them by hand into the riverbed, and you lined them up like you'd do a fence. And then you did a second row, about 4 feet apart or 3 feet, and you filled the space in between with rocks, wherever you could find rocks. So then when White River came flowing through there, it didn't stop the flow of the river, it just slowed it down. Slowed it down that it created a backwater above the dam that Mr. Parkins could then tap into to run over and operate his mill. So he had a free source of power. Today, over the years, this has all been flattened out, but you can see parts of that old dam. Here's a point on it, here's others. It's still there. It's kind of interesting. There was a man in Carmel that wanted to do a history of Perkinsville, called me, and he came over, and I took him all through Perkinsville and told him all about the town. And then I took him down to this dam, and he was fascinated by it. He said, I want to get out there and film that dam. I said, be my guest. He said, I need a high-definition underwater camera to do that. So a week later, he calls me, and he says, I bought a high-definition underwater camera. And so what he did was he walked along this side of it and this side of it with his camera underwater, filming it. It's so unusual that that's still in the river today after 187 years. A grist mill, the most common of all mills. Again, the source of water would turn a shaft, which would turn the gears. And in a grist mill, you had 2 stones. You had the bed stone, which was stationary, and then you had the runner stone that moved up on top of it in a circle. And you fed the grain into that, which filtered its way down into here, and a moving stone would grind that grain into real fine meal and dump it out over here. A flax mill. Pendleton had one built in 1869. It was a half-mile southeast of town, immediately north of the fairgrounds. Used straw fiber to make linen yard for thread for woven fabric. So, ladies, your dresses and so forth start out as a piece of straw. Anderson, 1871, located near the Catholic cemetery, was a flax mill. First grade used for gunny bags and second grade for upholstery. In other words, you had two different levels of fiber that it turned out. The better grade went to the linen, the lower grade went to the gunny sacks. The Catholic cemetery, if you're questioning where that is, that would be the St. Mary's Cemetery across from Old St. John's on Brown Street today. This textile machine, that's just an example. There were numerous types of textile machines. So this was just put up as an illustration of a machine. They could be all kinds of shapes, depending upon what kind of textiles you wanted to make. But again, they were operated by a flow of water and gears and pulleys. The cataract mills at Pendleton were probably the most famous of our mills in southern Madison County. The first mill was built in 1821 by a man by the name of William McCartney. It was a small log crib mill. The third owner was James Irish. He built a much larger mill on the south side of Fall Creek. A woolen mill was erected there by Samuel Irish on the north side of the creek, just below the falls, and it burned June 1st, 1865. And later that year, a stone and brick building was built. I have a picture of it. I'll show it to you. The woolen factory until 1870, when it was converted to a grist mill, was 4 stories in height, capable of producing 150 barrels of flour per day, supplied by Fall Creek and less low water when steam was used. They shipped product to New York, Cleveland, Boston, and Indianapolis. And they advertised as being the best mill in Madison County. I didn't say that, they said it. Adjoining a few yards east is a sawmill and a heading factory. The Huntsville Mills. The first mill replaced in 1830 by a 3-story mill. Attached was an oil and sawmill and a woolen factory, all destroyed by fire in 1848. Now you're wondering, what is an oil mill? An oil mill was used to crush, like linseed, to take the oil from it. Any kind of a seed or a nut that had oil in it, they would crush it to extract the oil from it. That was destroyed by fire in 1848. A 4-story grist mill was then built with a sawmill a few yards east around 1850. Mr. B.F. Amon acquired the property in 1872, and I have an illustration of his mill. It was supplied by Fall Creek through a mill grace and a turbine wheel. Now some pictures. This is the Alexandria Mill, opened in 1862 along what is today the Norfolk Southern Railroad. It's gone today, of course, but that's where it was. This is the mill in Chesterfield. It says the old Makepeace Mill near Chesterfield, which grinds the grist for the first settlers of Madison County, now a dilapidated wreck. Well, that's an understatement. The gentleman in the foreground is Dr. C.L. Armington, many years a resident of Chesterfield. Mill Creek is about out where I'm standing. This is on the side of the hill. Above it is where the baseball diamond is at Makepeace Park. This is the Dixon Mill and later the Henderson Mill, grist mills in Anderson. The Wellington Mills in Anderson, first the Germanna and then changed to Wellington. Germanna is probably our most famous of all the mills. My point in showing you all this is, look how prolific the mills were through Madison County. It shows you what an impact they had on the life of the early pioneers, and there was also, they contributed to the social life. What I wanted to show you here's East 5th Street in Anderson. Here's Alexandria Pike, and this is the old Pennsylvania Railroad. Everybody know where I'm at? I'm down at 5th and Main. If you take this out today, you go across the Truman Bridge, across the river. Okay, if you take this runs in, it becomes Main Street and takes you by the library, evidently. But look at all of the industry. These mills were all located in this area, in Anderson. And they would have all been steam-operated mills. This is the Salk Mill. I'll back it up. You can see it was here. And that's what it looked like. The Amon Mill, this is in Huntsville. The source of water was Fall Creek. But they tapped into Fall Creek way upstream and brought a mill race that ran through the mill and out into tail race and then went back into Fall Creek. That's how they operated the mill. This is the Wellington Mill. This is at the Big Four Railroad and Central Avenue. So we're just a short distance from where that mill was. And maybe some of you remember that. That was a feed store, grain and feed in my lifetime. Co-op. Fall Creek in Pendleton was the source of power for the mills at Pendleton. And that's probably one of the more famous mills. That's the Cataract Mill, built 1825. And they took water off of Fall Creek here. This is, how many of you ever went swimming at Fall Creek in Pendleton? Well, it didn't look like that, did it? No. If you walked around on the bottom, it probably felt like that. I remember how sharp the rocks were and so forth in the bottom of the pool. But this was what it looked like. Here's the falls before they brought them down to a narrow gap that's there today. But those falls supplied the power. And do you remember this? Do you remember ahead of the falls in Falls Park, I'm going to say 60 years ago, there were rock culverts that went through the park alongside the stream. And those were the mill races that were built out of rock to bring the water in to operate the mill. That's the Pendleton Woolen Mill that was across the falls. Here you can see those falls. You know what this guy's doing? Ice. Yeah, he's breaking ice. In order for that mill to operate, the water had to continue to flow. If the water freezes over, the mill shuts down. So his job is to stand out there and keep that water from freezing. I hope somebody brought him a cup of coffee every once in a while. Pendleton, outside their historical museum, talks about the importance of the mills in their area. The woolen mill for flour and sawmills erected here in 1825. But I want to call your attention to this. Lumber was sawed here for the first courthouse in Indianapolis. If you're going out of Pendleton on State Road 38 and you cross the creek and there's an American Legion post on your left, right behind that there was a mill, sawmill. And they sawed the lumber there for the courthouse in Indianapolis, the Marion County Courthouse. Well, the idea was they were going to float it down Fall Creek. But the problem is Fall Creek is not navigable all the way, especially in low water. So what they did, they put it on wagons and they brought it over to Perkinsville and loaded it on flatboats at Perkinsville and floated it down the White River to Indianapolis to build the courthouse, because White River was more reliable. Two Madison County mills have achieved a level of notoriety. This is their story. Moss Island and Killbuck, a tale of two mills. The Moss Island Mill. The Moss Island Mill, do any of you remember it? Okay. The Moss Island Mill was here. This is Moss Island Road as it comes from Anderson. Up in this area, it is Van Buskirk Road. Comes down, becomes Moss Island Road. Turns and goes west here, and then it makes a big turn and goes to Frankton, and we call it the Frankton Road. This is the Romine Road that dead ends here. Here's White River, and here is Moss Island. But the mill was here. Some pictures of the Moss Island Mill, postcard pictures showing you the old mill, and this was a toll gate house. In other words, you had to pay to drive on Moss Island. It was a turnpike, and there was a gatekeeper. There he is, and he'd stand there and collect your money. So he had a gate. He raised the gate, and you could proceed to Perkinsville or wherever you were going. This happened to be the Anderson-Perkinsville turnpike. I call your attention to the mill because I'm going to explain something to you here a little bit later. You see the water cascading over here? That's what they did with the water when they weren't using the mill. When they used the mill, there were gates on the side here that allowed the water to come in and fall and operate the turbines that operated the machinery. When they didn't want to operate the machinery, they closed the gates and the water just flowed over the side out into the tail race, which took it back into White River. A 1876 map showing the Moss Island mills on White River. And that little area right there is the Moss Island. It was created when they wanted to have a mill race deliver water to the mill. It was a solid piece of ground originally, but they dug a mill race here from the dam, and then they delivered it back into the river. The first mill was built in 1836 at Moss Island. It was created, the island was created by a mill race known as Snelson's, and it was about 20 feet wide. From my research, Mr. Snelson hand dug with a shovel a 20-foot wide mill race. There was a dam constructed above the entrance to the race. The river's flow slowed by the dam, causing a pool, and it was known as slack water. With the river flow slowed, the dam, the water entering the race flowed faster. In other words, you have a flow of water. You put a dam there, it kind of begins to back it up and slows it down a little bit. But if you have a mill race over here, then that water finds a new channel and it begins to speed up again. That's just physics. The increased water flow supplied the power. Now, I was explaining this all to a former county historian in Madison County, a man by the name of Dick Bowman, the man who preceded me, and some of you nodding your head, you remember Dick. And Dick loved to do artwork. And he said, "Can I create something for you that will help explain this?" I said, "You sure can." So this is his artwork, and I credit him with it. White River, the dam, the mill race that brought it over to the mill. Again, you had the option of not using the water or using the water and bringing it out here. And the tail race returned it to White River. And this was the Moss Island. Again, this length of mill race was hand dug, and it was 20 feet wide. Some postcard views of the dam here and here. It was an odd-shaped dam because the water was backed up here, and the Moss Island, this is Moss Island, the point of it, and the mill race disappears behind the Moss Island. We're looking north here, but this was an odd-shaped dam, and it created a lot of problems because they used the dam as a ford. Now that's okay when you can see the dam, but when the water level's up and you don't see the dam, and you're on a horse, and that horse is gingerly making its way across, and he gets out to this point, and he doesn't know he's got to turn, and he steps off into the river. That happened in a comical way to a Methodist minister from the church right across the street here, Methodist Church, in the 1860s. He went out there to marry a couple on a Sunday evening.
They baptized at the same time.
And good point. Can't answer that, I don't know. But he arrived at the wedding dripping wet, and long story short, he found another way back to Anderson. Now here's another view upstream. You see the main river channel. Here you see Moss Island, and then you see the mill race going off to the side. Possibilities. The mill's builder, a man by the name of Joseph Mullinex, selected the site due to its proximity to the planned northern extension of the Central Canal from Indianapolis, with its connections through the Wabash and Erie Canal to Lake Erie, the Lake Erie Canal to New York City, as I just explained to you, the Central Canal southern extension to reach Evansville on the Ohio River. Here's the mill, and my arrow points to the planned and surveyed construction for the Central Canal. So again, he's right across the river. He's right across the river, and he's ready to make a boatload of money. This was the original canal thing, which I think I showed you earlier. The original canal was to come down through Noblesville on down, but they rerouted it and brought it through Alexandria, Anderson, and over to Noblesville. So it was right in here is where the Moss Island Mill was located to take advantage of that. The canal failure and the panic of was caused initially by the panic of 1837. Mullinex also failed to pay his property taxes, I found out. So the mill was sold at a sheriff's sale. The new owners were Lloyd Brown and Frank Davis, and they took possession on January 18, 1845. Now they would have had to have paid the back taxes, which they did. The mill was known as both the Brown's Mill and the Davis Mill. It changed hands several times in a short span of years. The Moss family. John and Ann Moss purchased the 2-acre property. In 1867, the Moss Island Flouring Mill was opened. James Moss was the son of John and Ann. He owned the property for many years. Another son, William, bought the mill for $10,000 shortly before his death. That'd be a lot of money in those days. In 1873, the mill was destroyed by fire and is so common, no insurance. I don't know when people finally figured out you better carry insurance on your property, but everything that I ever find in Anderson that got burned, there was no insurance coverage on it. In 1875, Samuel Moss, another son, builds a 3-story mill on the site of the one that burned. It had 3 sets of millstones capable of making 75 barrels of flour every 24 hours. The large stones ground the farmer's corn into meal, his wheat, oats, and barley into flour. Many of the 20-plus owners operated a sawmill at the site during its history. Some made money while others lost, from what I could find. The improved machinery in the latter part of the 19th century killed the merchant mills. There was no railroad nearby, was another thing that hurt the Moss Island Mill. So he became a small neighborhood grinding, and that was his only source of income. On August 18th, 1930 issue of the Anderson Daily Bulletin stated a few weeks previous a part of the mill overhanging the mill race had fallen into the water. In 1932, the paper reported that until recent years, the mill continued to grind feed, but at present lies idle in a rather dilapidated condition. And in 1935, that mill was dismantled. The iron underwater buckets were turned over to the Boy Scouts and salvaged as scrap during World War II. That's the list of owners that I found that owned the Moss Island Mill at various times, starting with Joseph Mullinex, clear down to Benton Nip. Those are all the people that owned it. You see Snelson there, obviously a descendant of the man who dug the mill race. You see Nickel and King, they were hardware stores in downtown Anderson. And some other names there that are familiar to me. The Moss Island area. A small community flourished about the site for a time, and it was known as Toad Level. Gradually, Moss Island came to embrace all the surrounding area. In later years, the area became a popular swimming, fishing, and picnic site, and gypsies would come there beginning about 1910, and they would camp out, fish, swim, and do what gypsies do until the neighborhood complained, and then the sheriff would come and say, out, and they'd go. The ford. In the early horse and buggy days, travelers desiring to take the road to Anderson had to pay a toll of 5 cents at the gatehouse located next to the mill for the privilege of fording the tail race back of the mill. The tail race is the downstream part of the mill race where the impounded part of the water re-enters the river. There, the water was not as swift, and one could cross to the island and then over the dam to the other side of the river. And there's a picture of the dam, obviously in low water. I have no idea who she is or why she's there, but it's a lady, obviously all decked out, showing you what the dam looked like. I would love to know the rest of that story, but I don't. The bridge. How many remember the Moss Island Bridge? Okay, you remember the concrete bridge. Well, the first bridge there was built in 1869, the second one in 1910. Both were bowstring style. 1926 was the third bridge, concrete, that's the one we remember. And in 1986 it was closed. If you remember, it was not safe to cross that. School bus drivers complained that it was so narrow, only one car could pass over the bridge, and the sides of the bridge were crumbling. It was concrete, it was just not safe, so they closed it. I love this photograph because it's probably, in our collection at the Historical Society, this would be our oldest photograph. The occasion is the opening of the bridge at Moss Island. It is a bowstring bridge, 2 levels of bowstring, and you can see the workers are posing for the picture that's taken by the photographer who's come out from Anderson. But the occasion would be the opening of this bridge, because now with this bridge open, that turnpike that I told you about that ran between Anderson and Perkinsville was now open to traffic. So this was a big occasion. I know that the turnpike opened in 1869, so I'm dating this bridge to that. That's an old photograph for Madison County. Some other photographs then later on, you can see they raised the level of the bowstring. One thing I'll show you, this was lower because it was over ground. This was higher because it was over water. Why, I don't know, but that's the reasoning for it. I guess they didn't care if you fell onto the ground. And I was telling you about the gypsies. The gypsies camped out here. The gypsies camped out here on the north side of the river. I just think that's a neat photograph. These abutments, by the way, are still there today. Here it is, a later version of it, and I love this one. Isn't that neat? Whoever for the photographer was for that had an eye for photography to capture that scene. That's the bridge that we all remember. That's the mill that was built in 1875. This is after the first one burned. And again, when they didn't use the water, it spilled over the side. When they used the water, it fell on 3 turbines, 3 turbine wheels that spun when the water hit it to drive the machinery above it. And I thought you'd like to see it. This is the mill race coming into the Moss Island mill. You can see the water spilling here, and then it tumbles down. You needed at least 7-foot drop. You needed at least a 7-foot drop to develop enough horsepower to drive the wheel, to turn all of the cranks. And here are the gates that they could close off. And if you notice, what they've done here is they're funneling the water coming in from the race. They're funneling it down into a tighter space for the water to run faster, to provide more power. These are really neat photographs. I'm so thankful for the man that took them before the mill came down. Mill wheel operation. There were 2 types. You have a vertical and a horizontal mill. The vertical mill, you either had an overshot, a breast type, or an undershot. The horizontal mill was a tub or a turbine. The overshot wheel worked like this. The water came in a flume from the top, poured over the wheel and down into the race below. And the breast type just means that it came in at the mid-wheel level, and the undershot means that it flowed underneath. The tub wheel was much more powerful because this had fins in it. And as the water hit these fins, each one of these fins were moving and would drive the shaft at a much higher speed, much higher. And there's an example of the water coming down and falling on those fins. And you can see what a turbine wheel would do. Some examples of some popular, as early as 1862, the turbine wheels began to appear in the United States. We had one here in Anderson. I'll show that, tell you about that later. This is underneath the Moss Island mill. Look at all the debris that's gathered down there over the years. but you can see the power that those things could develop. And here are the mill wheels. This would be the stationary wheel. This would be the wheel that moved. And your grain then, when it was ground, it would channel its way out to the edge, just vibrate out and move out. Some scenes of Moss Island. This is the only scene I have that shows the mill race really good. I don't know who she is, but she's in a canoe, but you can see the width of this. Remember, that was hand dug. I hope he didn't do it on a day like today. This is the old gas pump that was out in front of the mill on Moss Island Road. 1926 is the date of this picture. Any of you remember Joe Hartman? He sold cider. I can remember my folks going out there and buying cider off of him on an October afternoon. That's the side of the mill today. Behind the mill is this. This debris is from when they tore the mill down and they just shoved all of this debris that had been supporting the mill on the back side, and there it is today. That's all that remains. I took the photograph in September of '09. And there's the bridge abutment for the original Moss Island Bridge. So you can figure those stones were laid in 1869. And here's Moss Island. Interesting. I told you the Army Corps of Engineers came along and began to open up the river in the 40s for flood control, and one of the things they did was remove the island. It was a prohibit the flow of water, so they removed the island. Well, Mother Nature says, I want an island there, Army Corps of Engineers. So I'm going to put an island back. So she's building. Mother Nature is building another Moss Island in that area. I've always said, if Mother Nature and man go head to head, my money's on Mother Nature. My money's on Mother Nature. But it is being built, again, by Mother Nature. This is all that's left of that dam that I showed you earlier. That's all that's left. The Moss Island. The Moss Cemetery is not far from there. The Moss family owned all that ground. And now the Killbuck Mill. The Killbuck Mill, to orient you, here's Frisch's on Broadway. Here's Broadway, here's Grand Avenue. Here's Maxwell's Trim Shop. Everybody with me? Well, Maxwell's Trim Shop sits on top of the site of the Killbuck Mill. And that is a couple of postcard views I have of the Killbuck Mill. I want you to pay attention to this loading platform right here, this wall, because the farmers would come up here, unload, and then pull away, and then they would also then come back to pick up their ground grain. They would park somewhere nearby and go in because it was a 3-day event. A day from wherever you lived in Madison County just to get to the mill, a day there while you waited for the grain to be ground, and then a day to get back home. So it was a 3-day trip. The day they spent there was a day to socialize and catch up on all the neighborhood news. And in the mill itself were shelves, and on those shelves were jugs, and in those jugs were whiskey. And on the jugs were inscribed initials. Well, remember this wall. That's part of the loading platform. Now the history of the mill. In 1860, a man named the name of William Sparks built a single-story sawmill. Also in 1860, he hand dug, here we go again, a mill race from Killbuck Creek to the mill and then to the White River, 2,000 feet long. 2,000 feet long was that mill race. He formed a partnership with a man by the name of A. Siddell, and they built a grist mill next to the sawmill. Frame construction, the mill was 36 by 40 feet, supported by stone pillars, had 4 floors, including the basement, a slate roof. Mill stones imported from France. Those stones cost $1,500 each. Each.
Oh, they're from France.
They're from France. But you think of the expense. But then once you've got them and you don't break them, you're in business for a long time. They aren't going to wear out necessarily. Sparks and Seidel operated the two mills until 1867 when they sold it to Mr. E.W. Clifford. In January of 1868, Mr. Clifford sold a half interest to John Hall. Later that year, Hall buys out Clifford and owns the whole thing. He makes a series of improvements there in 1868, adding a 48-inch American turbine wheel installed in the basement, furnishing 20 horsepower. Previous to that, the best horsepower they could develop was about 7. So he's tripled his horsepower. Means he can do a lot more work. In 1862, a 60-inch and 32-inch topsaw was installed, which increased the capacity by creating 2/3 maximum capacity of 2,000 feet of hardwood and 3,000 feet of softwood per day. 1862, the grist mill had 3 pair of stones operating. 2 were 4 feet, and 1 was a 3-foot stone. There were 3 American turbine wheels, 2 42-inch and 1 36-inch. Combined power under a head of waterfall was 7 feet, was 37 horsepower, doubling the previous horsepower. Again, the faster you can make those turbines turn, the more work they'll do for you. The maximum capacity per year was 60,000 bushels of grain they could grind there. 60,000 bushels of grain. They sold flour under the name Killbuck flour, famous flour for years. In 1907, a man by the name of John Goring sells the mill to the Union Traction Company. That's the interurban folks. The UTC wanted the dam on Killbuck Creek to increase the water supply used to operate boilers at their power plant. In other words, the mill had fallen on hard times. UTC, the traction company, says, we'd like to buy it so that we want to buy it to have that mill race because we want to be able to channel the water from Killbuck Creek over to the power plants to cool our generators. And so they sold it. What did they do with the water once it cooled the generators? They returned it to Killbuck Creek. It was stained. It was stained. And the mothers of the neighborhood told their sons and daughters, don't you go in swimming there at that swimming hole, or you'll get jaundice. Because the stain was a yellow stain coming off those generators. 47 years of mill operation ends. In the 1940s, Charles Leonard buys a 5-acre tract of land, including the mills, which is torn down in the late 1940s. Any of you remember Leonard's Drive-In? During this time, the millstones were purchased and they were moved to a museum in southern Indiana, and I do not know where they are. But the millstones are no longer there. They're in southern Indiana. The 12-inch diameter solid steel shaft lies a foot below the floor of Maxwell's trim shop and extends most of the shop's width. I went into Mr. Maxwell's trim shop one day and I told him what I was curious. I said, this was a mill at one time. He said, I knew that. And I said, anything around here that is left over from the mill? He said, yes. He says, several years ago, we decided to jackhammer up our floor and put down a new concrete floor. And in jackhammering it up, we found a steel shaft, 12-inch steel shaft, running across the width of our building that had been concreted over. And he says, that was part of the original milling operation. I said, what'd you do with it? He said, we just covered it up, so it's still there. You see a 1901 map of the Killbuck mill here. Here. Now I've taken you to Killbuck Creek, where the dam was located. The dam you see here. It's a concrete dam, built in 1860, or poured in 1862. Some of you might say, well, was concrete around in 1862? Concrete was around in the 1500s. It's been a building material for years, centuries. But this dam was here. It went across Killbuck Creek. In the mill race, you can just see it beginning here. This water built up. I was curious as to how high the dam was, how much water was there. And a good friend of mine, who's now no longer with us, Dick Mobley is his name, as a boy, used to swim there. So he went down there with me one day. He stood on what's left of the dam, and I said, show me how high that dam was. And that's what he's doing. Behind the mill where Maxwell's Trim Shop is, going out to the river, is the tail race where the water goes back into, or goes into White River. And you can see here, now that's just because the river had flooded, it's springtime, and the water had backed up in there. But you can see the water making its way to the river, here, here, and making its way all the way out to the river. This is the old bridge abutment for the Delaware Street Bridge, the Singing Bridge. This entrance to White River is right in front of that. So that gives you some idea about where the entrance to White River, where the tail race emptied into the river. Maxwell's Trim Shop. Notice this? Mr. Maxwell said to me, hey, there is one more thing I want to show you. When I was asking him, is there anything there at the shop that reminds him of that is from the mill? He said, yeah. He says, come outside, I want to show you something. He took me out and he showed me this right here. You remember the retaining wall that I showed you earlier? That's the top of it. He says, my workers decided one day that they wanted to get rid of it. They were tripping over it. So they took shovels. He said they got down 11 feet and they quit. Got down 11 feet and they quit. It was still going. So it's still there today. See how much lower you are standing at Maxwell's Trim Shop than up here where Frisch's is? That's because in 1937, when they built the bridge across on Broadway across White River to open up State Road 9, they had to fill all of this area in, had to raise it. Well, they got the fill from a house on Indiana Avenue. Behind the house, they had a steam shovel back there. And they dug earth, put it in dump trucks. The dump trucks then came down to the Delaware Street Bridge, over to Jackson and back up to begin to dump. 1937. The Delaware Street Bridge in 1937 has a wooden floor. Those dump trucks broke it down. It needed to be replaced. World War II is on the scene. There's no steel. So the bridge is closed and it isn't reopened until after World War II, when they then had steel to make the bridge floor that you remember as the Singing Bridge. That's the story. Again, Maxwell's Trim Shop, Killbuck Mill. Old photograph from a newspaper I found. The mill race entered at the very corner of the mill and dropped about 7 feet, as I said, to develop the power. This is a picture taken in 1936. It's abandoned. It again was a property of Union Traction. They used the mill as a billboard. And then the following year was the huge flood of 1937. And you can see White River has enveloped the old Killbuck Mill. The last photograph I have of the Killbuck Mill is around 1947, just before they tore it down, again being used as a billboard. And this is the mill that I was telling you about, that's the mystery mill. Stultz Mill, Anderson, Indiana, I have no idea. That narrow piece of water there, I have no idea where that is. It's too narrow for Killbuck, obviously too narrow for Pipe Creek, Fall Creek, or White River. So could it be Duck Creek, maybe, in Duck Creek Township? I don't know. I'd love to know where that was. In Indiana today, there are still mills that you can visit. Pictures of them. Here is a list of them and where they're located in Indiana. I suppose a lot of us have been to the Metamora Mill, haven't we? Squire Boone Mill. Anyway, there are mills throughout Indiana, places that you can visit. And we are done. I had a good time. I hope you did.